Hello and welcome to Tomorrow's Tech by IDTechEx. I'm your host, Dr. Tess Skirm, and in this podcast series, I will be interviewing an array of industry experts on emerging technology from IDTechEx. IDTechEx is a market intelligence company with a mission to provide clarity on emerging technology. And in each episode, our analysts will be discussing all kinds of topics, everything from virtual and augmented reality hardware, autonomous vehicles and flying cars, sustainability and energy storage innovations, medtech and wearables, 3D printing, advanced materials, and so much more. In each interview, we're going to explore what the future outlook is for each of these technologies, as well as endeavouring to find that elusive insight into hype versus reality. The topic of today's episode is augmented and virtual reality hardware, otherwise known as AR/VR. You might have already tried out or bought a VR headset in recent years, and you probably are aware of ongoing cycles of excitement and disillusionment surrounding products like Google Glass or the Apple Vision Pro. But do you really have a good idea of how disruptive this technology could be? Well, today's guest, Sam Dale, is a senior technology analyst at IDTechEx who has done extensive research into answering just this question. So, Sam, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Tess. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to have you. So perhaps let's start at the beginning. There's a lot of terms that are used to describe this technology area. You kind of see AR, VR, MR, XR, references to the metaverse as well. So perhaps to start with, could you just perhaps give us an introduction to this topic as a whole and maybe split out a little bit what the differences between these different terms are and which ones maybe we should be using?
Well, we've actually started on a weirdly difficult question here, but because the terminology around extended reality is we'd like to refer to all these technologies which kind of replace reality partially or fully with digital imagery. It's kind of fluid and it's evolving over time as the technologies evolve. So we're talking about a suite of technologies which we collectively refer to as extended reality or XR or spatial computing. But ones you've most likely had an interaction with already are virtual reality. So we're fully replacing reality with digital content. So you can go out and some people here may even have received one of these headsets for Christmas, and there's gaming applications of that, which is probably the key one, which most people have played around with before. But there's also kind of lesser known to maybe the public applications of using these for specialized training, kind of anything from surgery to fighter pilots. So there's more behind that than just replacing games consoles. On the other hand, there's these other sort of a branch of headsets which loosely fall under the umbrella of augmented reality. And that's where we have something which is kind of you can see through to the real world, and we partially replace reality or cover it with some digital content. And this could be anything as simple as sort of relatively kind of lightweight devices which are just overlaying text, so maybe giving you pointers of where to navigate to. The kind of best known example there is the Google Glass product, but there's been many more besides that, more recent examples from companies like Oppo and Xiaomi. And then there's kind of more involved devices from companies like Magic Leap and Microsoft HoloLens devices, which kind of fully replace they much more fully sort of cover reality with virtual content. So, there was this famous demo from Magic Leap a few years back with the idea of a whale sort of leaping out of the floor of a gymnasium, which turned out to not really be sort of widely what people use these headsets for. But people would love to use these for gaming, but at the moment, basically they're too expensive and they don't have all the features there. So the key uses are kind of being of those sort of high-end mixed reality capable augmented reality headsets have been kind of in industry. So again, for things like specialized training or to help guide surgery, or maybe to sort of help you maintain your chemical plant or something along those lines. So there's been a wide kind of range of applications.
Thanks, Sam. That's a really good introduction. So I think one of the main things I'm taking away is that even though these acronyms sometimes get bundled together, AR, VR, they're actually pretty different technologies. So, kind of as you mentioned, if we start with talking about the VR side of things. As you said, like it's the type of stuff people might have used to play games on or kind of had that kind of VR experience days. And then there are these other more industrial applications. from a technology side of things, in layman's terms, how does a VR headset work?
So I mean, it's easy enough to understand from a point of view of like the first VR headsets you could go out and buy, or some of the earlier ones anyway, were effectively a box with some lenses on it, which you could put your phone in. And that would magnify it and use the sensors in the phone to kind of track your head a little bit and basically just play an image into each eye that was effectively coming from a slightly different position. So you were viewing 3D content. And headsets today have come a long way since then, but effectively, yeah, we have the same thing when we have a display in front of your eye and then some sort of lens system to magnify and focus at a comfortable distance.
Okay. So that just brings me on, I guess, to one question I had is maybe on this lens aspect of things. So as an outsider, I might think that screens have been getting thinner for ages. You know, things like displays for technology, for TVs are really slim. So the idea of putting a small display into a pair of goggles might not seem like the most complicated thing to do. So why is it that they've only really been around in, the last couple of years?
So if VR headsets have kind of been getting a bit more compact, there's been this move from Fresnel lenses, which are kind of, you may have come across these before, as like, if you've ever seen like one of those magnifying glasses, which is kind of flat. It's effectively, you're taking like, if you imagine a standard lens, you're kind of splitting that down to little ridges. And it's basically just making the lens itself a little bit more compact. But that's the issue here isn't actually like the lens itself being sort of fat or the screen itself being fat. It's actually you have to put a fairly large distance between the lens and the screen.
Okay.
So that's made headsets relatively big. And in the last couple of years, there's kind of been these innovations in hardware technology. So, for example, improvements in molding processes, kind of the general design improvement, and also users being willing to spend a little bit more that have led to the adoption of this technology we call pancake lenses, which effectively kind of uses a load of polarizers and other optical components to fold the optical path. So if you imagine there's sort of a couple of lenses in there, the light's kind of bouncing between those to effectively act like you've got a much longer sort of lens system in an actual short kind of piece of optical equipment. And one of the benefits there is it makes headsets more compact, so you can take them with you more comfortably. And another one is that it puts cameras on the front of these headsets, which we can use to pass through the view of the real world a bit closer to where the user's eyes are. And that makes it a bit easier for the computers inside the headset to kind of make the view through the cameras kind of line up with what would actually be for your eyes, because there's less distance there. And that makes the experience of a pass through the real world a lot more attractive. And that's kind of enabled, been one of the factors enabling that technology to really see a rise in the last couple of years in headsets like Meta's Quest 3 and the upcoming Vision Pro, which you mentioned earlier, and so on.
Yeah, well, that's really impressive, because my other comment was going to be that the ones I've seen still seem overall pretty bulky. So have we got any chance of them getting a lot slimmer, or is there a kind of a fundamental limit?
So there's an element there of actually part of the bulk. If you look at a Quest 3, is kind of one of the recent ones. Actually, a lot of the bulk is just the surround around the eyes to block the light out. If you took that off, you actually see it's a relatively slim headset. But in terms of, if we're looking at really compact devices, what people probably care about a bit more there is augmented reality, just because you're more likely to be wearing that kind of all the time. Even something like Apple's Vision Pro, which is clearly designed to kind of be kind of a companion device to life, I suppose. It's one, the battery life's a bit limited, and two, there's something about not being able to see the user's eyes, even if you see the images of that kind of that display on the front of it, which sort of emulates the eyes being on the front. It's not, it's hard to sort of really simulate that experience fully. So if we're looking at really compact devices, AR devices are maybe kind of more the route to go down there. And also because if you're wearing it on your face the whole time, like maybe an AR device, which you might eventually want to replace your glasses and smartphone all in one, it really needs to be compact. So there's that really kind of, there's a real push there for those to shrink down.
Yeah, so on the topic of the Vision Pro, so lots of people I imagine will have seen the kind of teaser trailer video that was put out earlier in 2023. That's been described as a mixed reality headset, I believe. So just to clarify, kind of where does it really fit between VR and AR, in your opinion?
Yeah, so this is what I hinted at when I was answering the first question about it being more complicated than you think, because I've chatted to a few people across various companies about this, and we just decided to stick with a definition of VR headsets being something that's optically closed off in the real world, and be Vision Pro falling underneath that, and it's capable of delivering mixed reality experiences, because they used to call kind of any device, particularly AR devices, which were see-through, that could deliver that kind of experience. They used to be referred to by many people, including IDTechEx, as MR devices. Now there's these kind of VR type devices which have a pass-through of a camera to the real world, not an optical sort of see-through lens to see the real world through. They're getting referred to as MR or sometimes even XR devices, and it all gets really complicated. So we've just tried to keep the definition as simple as possible, with VR being optically closed off and AR being optically see-through to the real world, and then sort of those devices being able to deliver various types of experiences under that wider umbrella.
Yeah, so sticking with Apple for a second then, I guess the key thing I'm picking out there is that there's this multiple methods of providing an augmented reality-like experience. You can either have something that is transparent, or you can use cameras that are projecting the real world into your eyes. So that's obviously two quite different approaches, and a distinction I imagine some people might not be aware of. So on the more simpler side of things, backtrack, not necessarily simpler. A simpler user experience obviously would be to have a more transparent pair of AR glasses. So kind of what's the trends in that industry at the moment? Because it seems to be one that's lagged behind the VR side of things.
Yeah, so I guess the AR headset industry in general has, it's at least on the consumer side, often had a little bit of a failure to launch. So there have been a lot of kind of attempts at consumer-focused augmented reality devices, and they've tended not to get as far as maybe their manufacturers would have liked, and that's often been due to them simply being a bit expensive, or them not delivering the features that consumers would need, or arguably just the use cases not that are really compelling, having not yet been kind of properly identified, I suppose.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that AR devices haven't been a success, and indeed aren't getting to a point where they can sort of see a lot of interest for consumer uses, because despite all the kind of stories a decade ago about the Google Glass flopping, actually that product was only discontinued for use in industry, I believe, this year.
Right.
And, it had a pretty extensive network of users, particularly in the logistics industry, to help kind of guide workers around warehouses, and also to do things like remote maintenance support. And enterprise and industry has really been where AR glasses have so far found their home. Their users are less sensitive to paying more for them. And there's like a clear kind of return on investment if you can, for example, get your jet engine fixed a bit faster, because you can tell your worker how to sort of fix that part without them having to flick through the whole manual by having that sort of headset on their face, just to give one sort of very cherry-picked example there.
Yeah.
So that's been where they've really seen kind of the interest so far in the industry. But the eventual focus,
is that something that's happening now? Are there people out there wearing AR glasses to help fix engines?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think from my discussions with companies like Vuzix, just to give one, I believe that logistics so far, in terms of like things like warehouses, has been kind of a key early adopter. Remote maintenance, so with which that sort of jet engine example would fall under, has been another kind of key example. But the kind of conflict you see is, can you do it with a tablet or a smartphone? And there was an example of a company called Mara Reality, which actually Apple bought earlier this year, which was effectively using an iPhone with some big reflectors in front of it to kind of achieve similar goals.
Right.
It was a lot bulkier than any of these sort of specialized headsets, but it could do a very similar thing, and it was being used even for things like the US Air Force, I believe, was investigating it for use in training exercises and maintenance support and so on. So one key thing that AR headsets in general have had to do is kind of demonstrate that they can do more than a smartphone or a tablet, and kind of find those uses where being truly hands-free is really important to kind of justify their existence and justify the expense.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Another question I had for you was around something that comes up in the press a lot on this topic of AR, VR, and the problem of motion sickness, which I believe is bigger for VR than AR. But is this an issue that's still plaguing the industry in general, or is it something that's been broadly overcome?
Well, in terms of motion sickness, as you might expect, it's kind of more of a problem with VR. And if you're looking at things like gaming content, some elements of it are relatively hard to avoid about kind of putting you in if you imagine a flight simulator, putting you in something like that. Because if you're simulating, driving around in a car or flying around in a plane and you're sitting still, then obviously there's going to be that disconnect when you're in your ear. But there are some elements of it which kind of feel like motion sickness, which some have kind of referred to as VR sickness, which aren't just due to that kind of feeling of motion. And there's kind of one of the kind of contributing issues there is something called avoidance accommodation conflicts. So, if you imagine looking at the real world, you get multiple things give you kind of cues for depth. So it's if you've ever seen like one of those little stereo viewer things, or how a pair of 3D glasses work, that's effectively a similar thing to what's going on in a VR headset, right? You've got slightly different parallax for each eye. That's how the brain reassembles the image. But in the real world, you also have, your eyes are focusing at different distances as well to focus on objects of different distances from the eye. And those two things aren't happening at the same time in a VR headset or indeed one of those 3D viewers. And that's kind of known to contribute some level of discomfort for many users. And, there's been a lot of work on solutions there. So Meta's been working on these kind of really fascinating lenses called geometric phase lenses, which they can change their focal length without using any moving parts, just by applying electrical current across the components inside them. There's been interest in other approaches. So companies like VividQ and Serial, which have been working on holographic and light field displays, respectively, which kind of reassemble the real world more as kind of a true representation of kind of 3D reality rather than these kind of just relatively simple parallax between two eyes. And so there's also interest in these technologies for augmented reality, where the issue isn't so much to do with motion sickness there. You can see much more of a real world that tends to give you less of a problem, but to do with kind of helping with interaction. So you imagine if you're holding up an object that's shown as close to the eye in augmented reality, but it next to another object that's close to the eye, but you can't focus on both at the same distance. That's kind of going to break that immersion. So there's importance there as well, but it's not so much from the level of like looking at motion sickness. So there are some problems that are kind of en route to solutions, some which are ultimately quite difficult to solve, often by designing games and so on cleverly to try and avoid them.
So I get the other side of it as well. I mean, just to recap all of that, it sounds like there's a huge amount of innovation just solely on the optics of this stuff in order to make it more market ready. Is that broadly true? Is it kind of the refining of the optics design and manufacturing that's the kind of the biggest area of innovation at the moment?
So I mean, I'd say frankly there's innovation across the board, but in terms of hardware technologies, I'd say the optics are probably one of the biggest limiting factors there, particularly in augmented reality. Maybe not so much in VR. There's kind of like progress to keep on being made, but actually what we have today works pretty well. Versus in augmented reality, it's kind of getting particularly the optics we call combiners. So that's what it's used to overlay these images on top of reality on a transparent surface. So that could be anything as simple as kind of a lens and a semi-silver mirror to anything like the relatively complex waveguides, which many of these higher end headsets are using. And we have issues there. For example, some of them, like the relatively low cost ones used in kind of consumer focused devices today, obscure the eye so other users can't see it. So that kind of break social acceptability. Some of them, particularly waveguides, are very optically inefficient. That requires you to use a very bright display, which leads to the need for a huge battery or low battery life and so on. And across the board, many of these are kind of a bit expensive, again, particularly waveguides due to kind of a relative infancy of the manufacturing ecosystems involved. So, some of them require relatively complex manufacturing processes, which have kind of been adapted from a silicon industry, which, they're well proven, but something that works producing a relatively small kind of on the millimeter scale silicon chip doesn't necessarily scale so easily for producing a kind of more like display scale technology, like a waveguide. So yeah, there's kind of complexities there in terms of cost as well, which are particularly important for consumers.
Yeah, and I think the power thing you touched on as well is probably quite compelling for a lot of consumers as well. I think when you see the visuals of some of these more advanced headsets with still a battery pack tucked in the pocket, it can make it seem like it's not something they potentially want to be buying anytime soon. So I feel like getting the final product completely right for the end user when it's not something they're already particularly keen on putting on is maybe a big challenge.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of battery technology, clearly there's I have to say this is not so much my area compared to some of other IDTechEx analysts, but I'd say that's one of the other kind of important areas of innovation kind of generally in wearable technology, in terms of kind of, just increasing that power density as much as possible. But, better off reducing the power you consume as much as possible as a first bet. So by increasing the quality of optical technologies and so on.
Yeah. So I guess on the topic of things that are impacting other wearables as well, I guess as well as the optics is the control side of the AR, VR landscape. So what do you see as being the major trends there?
I mean, one clear trend recently has been in kind of across the board, like much wider adoption of camera-based hand tracking technology.
Yeah.
So instead of using kind of a couple of controllers, I mean, most headsets also allow you to do this as well, but actually tracking the hands without having to hold controllers, and that can kind of, you don't have to carry controllers around with you, and that's kind of why it appears to be the key, probably why it appears to be the key method of interaction with Vision Pro, for example. But two, it can offer a little bit more kind of involved simulation of reality. Maybe we can kind of use the fingers instead of kind of just pressing our buttons, kind of increase immersion a bit more. And eventually we'd like to transition towards these kind of really low profile smartphone replacement AR glasses in kind of maybe 10 years time or so. We really need to look at interactive technologies which kind of are as kind of unobtrusive, as low profile as possible, and maybe that hand tracking is a good place to start. But we're also looking at things like tracking the eyes, again, to do things like allow us to interact with interfaces. So that's becoming more common in VR headsets in particular. I believe the PlayStation VR 2 was the first to allow that in a consumer device, for example. But eventually we'd like to maybe move towards kind of technologies like these kind of wrist-based trackers to kind of track movement in the hand without having to do it optically. So you can type on a virtual keyboard, or maybe even things like brain-computer interfaces in the further future, which kind of, as far as I can tell, almost everybody working on kind of VR and AI headsets is interested in. But, there's been sort of particular talk of work from, again, the names that Meta and Apple keep coming up, but not just them, but many startups as well.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because there was also the phrase that went along with this market for a while that's kind of petered away, is the metaverse, and you touched on the idea of AR having the potential to be smartphone replacement. If we think kind of pretty speculatively about the really long-term future for this market, do you think that the original vision of the metaverse and things like a smartphone replaced world with AR is probable? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, in terms of metaverse discussion in general, there's a reason I haven't touched on that earlier, and I think it's simply that, actually the interest in that as a term has really kind of fallen off. For example, I was attending a presentation by Meta recently. You think might use the term metaverse a lot, and I was quite interested to find out that they didn't use that term once, even though it's still used in advertising. But I think it kind of comes down to consumer interest. There are kind of some quite difficult hurdles to overcome, which there is, very much progress towards in terms of like standards organizations like Metaverse Standards Organization, in terms of like how can we allow people to bring their avatars between different companies or different providers, virtual spaces and so on. But it kind of need to look at actually what are consumers interested in, and sort of try and relate the discussion of the metaverse to, I believe there was maybe a little bit of a post-COVID effect that was still going on there.
Yeah.
So maybe people, virtual interaction is still enjoyed by a lot of people, but I think people maybe underestimated the value of face-to-face interaction in that kind of original time of hype for it, and therefore kind of overestimated the value of virtual interaction. as they hadn't really transitioned back to that. So technologically, many of those things are kind of feasible, but the issue is kind of maybe more politically and in terms of legislation, like how can companies work together? How can we sort of how can we regulate this? How can we make standards that allow interoperability of different companies' virtual spaces? And more to the point, what do users actually want in terms of sort of level of immersion with technology? It comes down to something I often talk about is like, do people want immersion in technology, or do they want their technology to be low profile? Do they want it to get out of the way? And I think that's kind of an important narrative generally to consider in terms of how we interact with technology, which I honestly think the jury's still somewhat out on. I'd probably fall into they want technology to get out of the way camp.
Right.
But many people would fall into the other one. So that comes down to a lot of that is my sort of opinion as an analyst, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, on the first thing you said that struck me, it's definitely true that the latest conference cliche is it's so nice to be in person. So I think that that's recognised globally, isn't it? So I hadn't considered the flip side, which was potentially the previous overvaluing of certain virtual experiences. And I'm glad you brought it up, because the other thing I wanted to chat to you about was this kind of antithesis of, on the one hand, AR's got this big potential to kind of unchain us from our devices, but on the other hand, it's going to increase kind of the time that we spend with our eyes looking, engaging with everything from social media to, each other. So is AR a friend or a foe in this battle against kind of social media addiction and the rest? It can become quite philosophical and existential.
Yeah, I mean, again, like you said, it's kind of two sides of a coin there. Maybe it makes technology blend in more seamlessly, so it feels like less of a distraction from real life, but maybe having greater kind of sort of having even more common interactions with social media and so on is just going to increase the kind of level of addictiveness there. So I think that's one of those things that is going to, again, kind of become clearer what people want. Do they get enough kind of interaction with technology as it is from their smartwatches, from their smartphones? And do they value kind of an extra presence of social media in their lives from smart glasses and AR glasses and so on? I think realistically, until there's wider deployment, actually answering that question definitively is not going to be terribly possible there.
Yeah, and maybe a lot more steps along the way of evolution of things like social media with the rise of AI and the rest in the meantime. Another thing I wanted to just ask you about, and you mentioned it earlier, I read in your report on this topic that in the case of people like Apple in the space at the moment, it might be that they're not necessarily looking for huge swathes of revenue from direct sales of things like their first generations of MR headsets, but instead they're just trying to kind of introduce the spatial computing ecosystem idea to the general consumer. So what is spatial computing in simple terms?
Yeah, so I mean, it's again one of those terms that gets kind of used with slightly different definitions, but I would kind of pose it best as, if you look at spatial computing as we're transitioning from us largely interacting with computing in a 2D environment right now, largely looking at it on a screen, to looking at actually it kind of forming a 3D environment. So maybe it feeling more akin with our interactions of real life. And that's what people are looking towards, I suppose, spatial computing.
Okay. And is AR or VR kind of completely underpinning the possibility of spatial computing, or is it just one way that it could kind of evolve?
So you might describe those as kind of a major input, like major endpoint entrances to spatial computing. Actually, in many ways, things like the smartphone kind of also help us kind of define some of those early use cases there today. There's been sort of AR apps on the smartphone. Maybe the first sort of famous one was Pokemon Go, I suppose.
Yeah.
But things like e-commerce through sort of things built into IKEA's and Amazon's apps and so on. You can place your chair and your virtual chair in your room to kind of help you know if you want to buy it.
Yeah.
But the key kind of eventual endpoints would expect to be VR and AR devices, but they're not the only thing involved in there. There's sort of wider innovations in things like kind of edge computing. We need kind of great sort of evolution probably in 5G and even 6G networks, and also newer communication standards to allow these devices to communicate with no latency with remote computing. And, there's a lot of other technologies that go in there as well, but VR and AR are kind of these key entry points for the end user, I'd say.
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, I was literally playing with the IKEA place your chair in a room tool last night, so had no idea that I was on the fringe of engaging with spatial computing. That's good to know.
Did it work for you? Did you find the chair you wanted?
I haven't found the chair that I wanted just yet. The search continues. Okay, so for the last portion of the podcast, and we've been doing it throughout, but we like to really focus on the long-term future, and perhaps also an element of trying to distill where's the hype and where's the reality. So I think we've probably spoken quite a lot about what the future could hold, but if you've got any further comments about what you think, 10, 20 years time, what we might expect to see, and then after that, beyond that, where in the space at the moment would you say there is anything particularly overhyped, or maybe the opposite? Is there anywhere there's too much skepticism?
So, I mean, I'll caveat this by saying that my reports here kind of look more at a 10-year time frame, and then a little bit of discussion beyond this. What I've kind of said in my forecasting is that in VR devices in general, we're not expecting kind of like explosive growth, but that market is kind of already relatively well established. Devices are selling now in the tens of millions for the best selling out there, like Meta's Quest 2. So it's not exactly a small market as it is. But so we're sort of expecting to see kind of sustained kind of growth there, as kind of more people are just interested in what these devices can do with sort of innovations, which will probably come from sort of next generation on, from the Vision Pro, for example, maybe being one of the next drivers of interest there. As that device gets more cheap or those devices get sort of more affordable for the higher end ones for consumers. But looking, I'd say as kind of a much earlier stage technology, looking at the AR market becomes a little bit more interesting from my point of view as an analyst, in terms of overall forecasting. And that's where we expect to kind of see, I suppose, more growth. So we've actually forecast kind of a growth rate for the next 10-year period and kind of revenue from AR headsets of 26% compound annual growth rate, which is which is I believe around 5 times higher than our forecast in terms of growth rate for virtual reality, and that kind of reflects the early stage of that technology. As on one hand, of course, prices are expected to come down, as often does, but more as kind of more use cases have become well established. So actually, consumers see more interest in using AR headsets themselves, as the value of the ROI of AR headsets in industry kind of becomes further demonstrated, and as features like contextual AI kind of really sort of add value for users of AR headsets. So that's where we expect to see kind of most growth in terms of percentage, but in terms of you shouldn't forget the VR market is much bigger today. So despite the fact that growth number is a lot lower, it doesn't mean there's not a lot of growth going on there. In terms of where I believe that maybe hype's kind of been a bit down from what it should be, I think kind of these narrow field of view AR devices, which are able to do kind of things like maybe help you, like display workout details, display bits of notification to help you navigate and so on. They're actually getting to a point where they're kind of relatively affordable. You can go out and buy a pair of sports sunglasses with a display in them to kind of give you those kind of features for about $300, I believe.
I think I saw some swimming goggles with something in the other day. Didn't click in deep enough to know if it was actually something. I was going to say there's also AR, but there's products there for swimming as well, and so on. And but I think we're going to start to see those maybe used a bit more frequently. I have to say I could see the value for that personally when I'm out hiking. If I didn't have to get my phone out to look at a map, that'd be nice. If they could just sort of just show me where to turn next, that'd be lovely. And actually, those devices are at the weight of a normal pair of glasses now. Right. I actually weighed my own glasses and found that they were heavier than the advertised weight of one of the, I think it was the Engo Eyewear 2. I was looking at they're actually heavier than that. And those features are only going to continue to evolve. We've got some really impressive looking products kind of doing similar things that are just about to launch out of China.
I don't know how to pronounce this company's name, unfortunately, but LA Week, I think, is about to release a pair powered by some sort of really, really impressive bits of optics technology. So I think we're going to see a lot of kind of emerging interest in those technologies as they become more mainstream. We see like legitimate benefits over things like the smartwatch for those kind of use cases. I say maybe from my point of view, there's at least in the kind of medium sort of 10-year term, there's maybe a little bit of overhype placed on the idea of AR devices replacing the smartphone overall. That's not to say I don't believe that will happen within 20 years, but I think maybe it is in terms of things like the hardware technology and basically getting things falling off the wall all the time. It's going to maybe take a little bit longer than that 10-year period. I've kind of talked about some of the reasons for that already, particularly in terms of just getting your battery small enough to do this kind of general purpose tasks while really kind of offering kind of a competitive performance to what you get out of a smartphone already.
Yeah. Okay. So I can expect to still be having to hold a smartphone for a little bit yet, but potentially in my lifetime, it's not totally unrealistic that it could be gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a safe enough bet, do you think?
I think that's a safe enough bet.
Okay.
Or at least sort of supplemented quite heavily in any case by a headset.
Yeah, sure. What's the coolest application across VR and AR that you've seen? Because obviously there's so many kind of fragmented niche things, like you mentioned, in kind of looking at engines, and also like the medical industry, I think sometimes gets quite a lot of attention. What would you say is the coolest thing that you've seen?
I think possibly my favourite has been kind of actually both devices we classify as virtual and augmented reality being used in rehabilitation or kind of support of people with various vision conditions.
Yeah.
So there's been examples from Panasonic there, I believe, working with people with macular degeneration. There's been various kind of AR devices which their optics and displays are set up so they it doesn't really depend on the shape of the eye lens. So if people have issues with, the lens in their eye kind of deteriorating, then these devices can actually help give them visual guidance and a better view of the real world. And indeed, I believe that as kind of AI features become more commonly embedded into these headsets, there's been many sort of demonstrations of things like basically subtitling the real world, whether that be for things like translation or for, again, assisting people who may be deaf or hard of hearing as well. So I think a lot of these assistive applications are kind of one of the most, I believe, valuable for these technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Sam, last question for you. If you had to say a couple of sentences or have some final comments that you think if someone listening to this today has only really learned about AR or VR for the first time, kind of should they mainly remember about what this industry is about, or where it's going, or where it's not going? kind of what would be the key thing to take away?
I'd say don't, despite the fact that the interest in the term metaverse might have died down, doesn't mean the interest in these hardware technologies has died down at all, and doesn't mean that the metaverse and AR and VR are the same thing. These technologies are still really of interest. There's a lot being poured into them, and there's sort of consumers are really still continuing to show interest in things like particularly VR devices. And I'd say that actually, if you haven't had a chance to go and play Beat Saber or another VR game or have a VR experience, then actually it's really accessible to you. Or to most people in any cases. There are VR arcades probably in most major cities now. It's relatively, at least for someone in such a privileged position as ourselves, it's relatively affordable to go out and try one of these headsets for yourself. So if the opportunity is there, I'd really suggest taking it because it's a lot of fun.
Cool. So basically the language might change, the buzzwords might change, but a lot of the driving forces for why this technology could continue to find a market are still there, and we should all go and have a go at one of these terrifying zombie VR experience days that I've heard so much about and avoided so far.
Yeah, to have a go. It's a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your expertise. And actually, one more question. There was another one.
Okay.
What are you going to be looking at next in terms of technology topics? I know that you write about a range of things, not just AR and VR. So what's next for you?
Yeah, so I mean, aside from my work on AR and VR, I also look into the use of AI in material design, which we call material informatics, and that's what I'm currently working on. A new update there.
Cool. Oh,
yeah, that's a really exciting topic as well.
We will have you back on to talk about the buzzword of the year, AI.
I like to choose the buzzwordy topics.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you so much for listening to Tomorrow's Tech, hosted by IDTechEx. IDTechEx offers independent market intelligence on emerging technologies. For more detailed information on this topic and many others, please go to idtechex.com, where there are dedicated research reports on the emerging technologies we cover, as well as articles and free-to-attend webinars.